G'day, folks. Welcome, everybody. It's Wednesday. That means it's Wednesday lunch and learn time. We're going to be doing content owner and management today. So we're continuing on with our adoption roadmap. I'll give you the link for those if you're joining and you haven't got the adoption roadmap documentation link. I'll pop that in the chat for you, but I'm assuming most of you kind of know the journey we're on at the moment. So this is the third session we've done. So just to rewind a little bit, we spoke in the first session, we spoke about data culture. We had a bit of a look at an overview of kind of the adoption roadmap and kind of what that looks like. I think this image sums it up the best. So we've spoken about data culture, we've spoken about the executive sponsor, and we've spoken about the center of excellence. So they were the three topics we've already covered. So now we're getting down a little bit more into some more of the specifics, particularly around content ownership and management. This is a really, really important subject as far as I'm concerned. This is going to drive your workspace strategy, so how you organize your workspaces. Workspaces, also everything to do with how stuff gets organized. I also, as an interesting little aside for those of you that are here, I was contacted by Matthew Roche, who's one of the contributors on this, and he's interested in attending our little meetup. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks he'll get a chance. He's in the US, so it's a pretty hard time zone thing for him, but he's going to stay up late and hang out with us for an hour, which would be cool. And I'll probably get him to maybe present some of that stuff, so you get to hear it from the horse's mouth. And maybe I can convince Melissa Coates as well, the other author, to join us. So that'd be cool to actually speak to. So Matthew's on the Power BI CAT team. The CAT team is the customer adoption team, I think is the name. That's the guy in a cube. Those guys are on the CAT team. Phil Seamark's on the CAT team. Chris Webb's on the CAT team. So they're sort of the executive customer facing team for Microsoft that do all that cool content. So that'd be great if we could get Matthew to come along to one of our sessions. I'm sure he's got a lot to say about this kind of stuff. Anyway, fingers crossed. So, yes, we're talking about content ownership. Content ownership. So when we're talking about content ownership, we need to talk about the strategies, the different strategies for how you would sort of how you would deploy Power BI into your organization, right? And so this is a fairly well-worn path from a Power BI perspective. Microsoft have kind of always had this concept of either you do it business-led, you do it as kind of a what they used to like do a combined kind of effort, which they now call managed self-service BI, and then there's a concept of enterprise BI, corporate BI they used to call it. And so what's the difference between these things? So this is really the difference between having a centralized BI team or IT team sometimes managing all of your BI, all the way through to sort of the Wild West where business do everything, it's all business driven, and it's completely decentralized. So you can see here in this graphic, we've got our business self-service BI, everything's decentralized, ownership of the data is decentralized in that business own the data, report ownership, the business own the reports. In a full enterprise BI, everything's centralized, right? So data ownership is owned by the enterprise BI team, report ownership is owned by the enterprise BI team, and then there's this concept of a managed self-service BI where data is owned by the IT or BI service, but your individual reports are potentially owned by individual business units. And so you have to think about how you want to implement Power BI in your organization. And we can talk a little bit more about those different usage scenarios for these different areas. And we did speak about usage scenarios a little bit at the end of our first session, where we were speaking about that sort of managed self-service BI situation. If you're looking for information about usage scenarios, there is a new piece of documentation, which is just below the one that I sent you the link to, but I'm going to pop another link in the chat here, which has got our usage scenarios overview. I'll just bring this over here so you can have a look. So the different usage scenarios, so you've got personal BI, team BI, departmental BI, enterprise BI, managed self-service BI, customizable managed self-service BI, my favorite, self-service data prep, prototyping and sharing. So, and all of these are different usage scenarios for Power BI, right? And so this is where you get to see Melissa's great work where she does these amazing these amazing graphics that give you the different usage scenario. And then you've got here the different steps that you can go through, right? So you've got a data flow creator who works in Power Query. This is managed self-service. This is self-service data prep, right? So this is where people are making their own data flows. And so they're using data flows to create their own data sets. You see, it's quite a complex usage scenario. If we go back to maybe a more simple one, just a departmental BI, you have a different set of artifacts and tools that are being used in the Power BI service. So this is a great little way to get a bit more clarity about what your usage scenario is for your organization. And so I do want to go through these in detail in one of these lunch and learn sessions potentially. We'll go through a couple of these. Like I said, my favorite is customizable managed self-service BI scenario. That's where you have shared data sets, but then each person can go and query their own data sets and then extend that data set and republish it back up to the workspace. So interesting scenario. But each scenario, depending on your size of your organization and how you want to use Power BI, is going to have different implications for you. So there's your usage scenarios there in that documentation. Okay. Let's go back to content ownership. So your organization's data culture is the driver for why, how, and whom each of these three content sort of strategies are implemented. So under Business Self-Service BI, the content's owned and managed by the creators and subject matter experts within a business unit. Sometimes it's called business decentralized or bottom-up. Managed self-service, where the data is owned by the centralized team and your business units are going to create their own reports. Ownership strategy is also known as discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. That's a term that Microsoft used to use to describe its own BI scenario. So I assume that that's the one that they're using then, if that's the case. And then we also have the Enterprise BI, where all content is owned and managed by a centralized team, such as IT, Enterprise BI, or a center of excellence. And so that's a pretty common scenario these days. You find that a lot of people have that kind of scenario because business-led's really hard. And so is potentially managed self-service. I think managed self-service is probably the aspirational goal for a lot of organizations. It's unlikely that an organization operates exclusively with one content ownership and data management strategy. So you might be trying to do two at once. Depending on your culture, one strategy might be far more dominant than the others. The choice of strategy can differ from solution to solution or from team to team. In fact, a single team can actively use multiple strategies. If both consumer of enterprise BI content and a producer of its own self-service content, right? So you might be consuming sort of the official and then creating your own as your own self-service. The strategy depends on a couple of different factors. So let's have a look at the factors that might affect what strategy you decide to pursue. Just get rid of our little overview here. Don't think we need that. So what are the requirements for your reports? So what types of reports do you need to make? That's going to obviously affect the strategy that you choose. Your user skill level. Yeah. So how well people can do Power BI. That's a big factor. Obviously people who, if you don't have that, people who aren't comfortable with building sort of modeling in Power BI, for example, you're not going to really have much success rolling out a full self-service BI strategy that involves people doing their modeling. So you've got to think about the training requirement for that. Ongoing commitment for training and skills growth. Flexibility. So how flexible does it need to be? Are you a fairly agile organization where data is changing all of the time? Or are you an organization where things are pretty rigid, in which case, like a corporate BI solution is appropriate? And you'll find that, a lot of organizations that run corporate BI, it's because they have fairly slow moving data. Corporate BI is really good, what do they call it? Enterprise BI is really good for sort of rigid, slow moving sort of data sets, like things like your financial accounts, for example, is often, where you're doing something like your BAS doesn't really change format very often, right? So you can build a report and it kind of stays the same. The calculations associated with that stay the same. And so you can usually set up a fairly rigid pipeline that doesn't require that kind of agility. But, if you've got a situation where your organization's constantly changing, or you've just had a new CEO come in and they're changing the organizational structures, and so you're going from a a hierarchical to a flat structure, or you're doing, and people are changing cost centers and things like that. That's where financial reporting, where you've got this really rigid sort of financial reporting, starts to sort of fall over, because you need to make all of these changes. Those changes are embedded into a rigid system, and so it starts to become messy. And you find that's where a lot of the tension is in large organizations when it comes to business intelligence, is when things change. And so how much flexibility do you need for your organization? How complex things are as well is going to be a consideration. And of course, how much executive sponsorship you have, right? The priorities of your leadership, which we spoke about last time. Organizations' data culture, particularly its position on data democratization, has a considerable influence on the extent of which the 3 content ownership strategies are used. In other words, if you have a drive for democratization of data, where people have access to their own data, you're going to find that business-driven BI is going to be much more heavily used. Whereas if it's not there, then you're going to probably find you're in a corporate BI or enterprise BI situation. But there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I think that's important. Let's put that here. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. Each organization's governance model and approach to content ownership and management should reflect the differences in your data sources, your applications, and the different business contexts in which you're trying to implement this. Okay, how we own and manage has a significant effect on governance, right? So how content is owned and managed has a significant effect on governance, the extent of mentoring and user enablement, needs for the user support, and the center of excellence operating model. So content ownership starts to become at the forefront of how we drive the adoption of Power BI within the organization. The level of, okay, so we haven't spoken about we haven't really covered governance much, but they cover this in the governance article. The level of governance and oversights depend on who owns and manages the content. Yeah. And then the scope of that content's delivery, and then the data subject area and how sensitive it is, and then how important it is, right? So these are kind of your standard kind of governance questions that you're going to be asking of your users, or of your looking at your content. And so you need to think about that, because this is what's going to drive your whole strategy. In general, you'll find business-led self-service BI content is subject to the least stringent governance and oversight. That's why I call it the Wild West, right? So if you're using business-led self-service BI content, it's going to be very difficult to provide governance over that content. You're not going to be able to put a lot of oversight over the top of that content, because people are kind of doing their own thing. So your personal BI and team BI solutions, and those will be links off to the usage scenarios. If you're going for managed self-service BI, managed self-service BI is subject to moderately stringent governance and overlay, and could include things like team or departmental BI solutions, right? So just the difference between these two. Personal BI or small teams, they could just be creating their own stuff. It's the content, the scope of that content is only for a person or for a team. So it's not worth putting governance over the top of those types of solutions, because the scope of it, the risk is so low that, the person's only really sharing it with themselves or with a small team. Why bother putting stringent governance over the top of it? Whereas you might, when you get up to sort of maybe larger teams and departments, then you're starting to think about how much governance and oversight might need to go into your BI solution. And then, of course, where you've got rigorous governance, you're in a highly regulatory environment, then you're going to be looking at enterprise BI style solutions. So this is where you can mix the different strategies depending on the different needs you have in your organization. And so one size doesn't fit all. Organizational adoption measures the state of the data management processes and governance. The choices made for content ownership and management significantly affect how organization adoption is achieved. I think that's important. That the choices made for content ownership and management significantly affect how organizational adoption is achieved. And so we have this concept of people need to own the content, right? And I think that's something that it's can be a difficult thing, particularly on the business side, to drive the ownership of BI or data content. Right? There's a lot of expectation from the business in a lot of organizations that the BI team or someone in the BI team or some data guy own the content, or the person who's responsible for the support of the application, for example. So if you've got let's say you're in a hospital and you've got a patient management system, then they say, well, that patient data is owned by the people who run the patient management system. But who's the business owner of patient data inside your organization? And then anybody who works in a hospital, and I know there's a few of you on the call, it's not just a patient, right? You have inpatients and outpatients. You have ED, right? So emergency department people who come through. So and then you have maybe aged care facilities, right? And they're not called patients at all, right? So you've got this general concept of a patient, and then you've got all of these subsections of that piece of data that are potentially owned by different people, and it all needs to come together in a single data set for the purposes of reporting. So that's a really, really tough thing to get by. And this is where we start talking about content ownership. We have this concept of a data product, your patient table, for want of a better term. You then, who owns the patients? Well, there's all these business owners, but somebody needs to own that data product and be responsible for creating that product in a reliable way, that all the sources are correct and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of ownership and stewardship. So there's lots of roles related to managing data. Roles can be defined in many ways. They can be easily misunderstood. So we've got a table here that presents the possible ways you can conceptually define different roles. So you hear, and you might have heard this a lot, I haven't seen too many people in Australia with this role title. Be interesting if any of you guys put your hand up if you know a data steward, or you have data stewards inside your organization. No, I can see some shaking of heads there from Steve. Yeah, I don't see data steward as a role title in organizations, right? And so, but these are the people who are responsible for defining and managing acceptable data quality levels and master data management. Master data management is a huge problem. Like, I don't know if it's international. I don't know if it's just an Australian thing where we like master data management. No one really has a great solution for it. But everybody seems to struggle with it. Really large organizations that I've seen, like I've worked on master data project. Everybody's done some kind of master data project, and I just never see it done well. Like, I don't know if it was old SQL Master Data Manager. I've seen that done a few times. People trying to manage master data. Dataverse is the latest master data management kind of solution, and it's really tough. And I think that's because of this lack of this idea of having data stewards, of people who are responsible for managing the data aspects and actually, defining that data quality and then staying on top of that, rather than kind of this sort of IT can look after it because they look after the databases. They're responsible for the data, and that doesn't work. IT have other responsibilities they're interested in. They're more interested in making sure the lights are on, that kind of stuff. Separate from that, you might have a subject matter expert, right? So this person might know data quality and master data management, but this person knows the business definitions of what data means to the business. What's it used for? How do you access it? How is it presented to others? What makes sense? What doesn't? The hospital context is a really interesting one for that, right? Because you've got this a lot of subject matter experts for particular pieces of data. What does an acute inpatient mean versus something else? Then you've got technical owners, and they're the ones that people often think of as these data owners because they're the people who create, maintain, publish, secure access to data and reporting artifacts, usually reside in IT or a BI team. They might be the person responsible for maintaining the application where the data is captured, for example, or one aspect of the data is captured. So you're going to have someone who, has that technical ownership over data and reporting artifacts. And then your domain owner. So your domain owner is going to be a high-level person, right? The person who understands who makes decisions about this. Okay, we have this, we're capturing patient data over here, we're capturing patient data over there. There's a conflict between the definition of those two things. We need to choose which one we're going to be reporting to the board or whatever. That kind of decision needs to go to the domain owner to say, this is going to be our definition of a patient and how it works. Assigning ownership for a data domain tends to be more straightforward when managing transactional source systems. So those transactional source system owners. In BI solutions, data is integrated from multiple domain areas, right? So you're coming from a lot of different areas, as I kind of said. It's then transformed, enriched, might be added, you're adding columns, you're adding definitions, you might be doing some categorization of data as you go through, so that you can analyze things downstream. So the topic of ownership becomes more complex, and that was kind of what I was getting to with that patient example earlier. So we need to be clear about who's responsible for managing data artifacts. It's crucial to ensure that a good experience for content consumers, so these, especially if you're trying to do a self-service scenario, I want to be able to consume your content with confidence. Who do I contact if I've got a question about the data? Yeah, how do I provide feedback to say I don't think this is right, or something's not correct about it? How do I get it enhanced? How do I add a column? How do I add a categorization to that data set? And then how do I get support on that data set? So they're thinking about those data sets, who owns those data sets, and how that works. So content owners can set your contact list property inside the Power BI service. So you can actually within the service, you've got the option to set content ownership. And I think we looked a little bit at, when you're consuming content in Power BI, you've got the option to do that. And then you've got that concept of, promoted data sets and certified data sets, right? All that kind of stuff starts to play in here. So a little bit of that governance stuff as well. I'll see if I can bring it up as an example. So if I go to get data from our Power BI environment, we've got our data set, the endorsement level, but we also have the name of the owner, and then the sensitivity levels as well. So you've got this governance stuff built into the Power BI service that allows us to do that. And I can see the ones that I own as well. So that's that. Okay, so how do we be successful with ownership? How do we ensure that, we're going to be successful with the way getting owners on board? So first is around defining who's who in the zoo, right? So define how ownership and stewardship terminology is used in your organization. Like I said, I haven't seen many people with the job title steward. So, what's the equivalent in your organization for a data steward? What are they? And what are the expectations of that data steward if you're going to have that role? Because I'll tell you, every single piece of recommendation stuff that I see coming out of not just Microsoft but other sort of data places, they're always talking about stewardship of data, and so it's a huge issue to think about. Setting the contacts for your workspaces. Yep. Individual artifacts to communicate ownership and support responsibilities. So each workspace needs to have a contact, someone who's responsible for that piece of content. And I'm sure we'll get to some more workspace stuff. I've got some stuff on Workspace, some separate stuff on Workspace we can talk about. Set 2 to 4 workspace administrators to conduct an order of workspace admins on a regular basis. Not so sure about giving you a hard and fast thing you have to do twice a year or whatever, but you do need to audit your workspaces at some point, over and ensure, because there's going to be Power BI just grows over time. Stuff happens over time, and depending on your workspace strategy, you might be allowing people to create their own workspaces, for example, which is risky because what happens? You get workspace sprawl. Stuff starts appearing in your Power BI. There was a huge problem in the early days of Power BI where it was tied to groups, and many of you will remember this, right? So you had every time you created, say, a SharePoint team site, you would also get a Power BI workspace that would just appear out of nowhere. And so fortunately they decoupled that with the modern workspaces, but that was a massive problem because you had organizations that just had thousands of workspaces overnight, basically, and they're like, where are all these workspaces coming from? And it's because IT's off making groups for people, and that it sort of depends how your organization uses those SharePoint groups and that kind of stuff. So workspace administrators, people to own those workspace. Include consistent branding on reports to indicate who produced the content. This is a really good idea. So if you've got consistently branded reports, then you've got this, and you can potentially put help and contact information and help within the report surface itself. Yeah. So like an image or a text label located in the footer or in the header. is really valuable for people when they're exporting the report from the Power BI service, or they're having a look at the report. So using templating, and we'll talk about templating at some point as well. That's going to encourage people to make it easy for them to create consistently branded content, and also give you a more consistent thing. This is particularly good when you're doing that if you've got some stuff that's self-service and some stuff that's enterprise BI. If you've got really well branded enterprise BI reports that follow a particular quality sort of standard, then it really sets them apart from the sort of the stuff that people throw together in Power BI. And you can kind of tell at a glance if something's a certified, quality controlled enterprise BI report versus something that kind of, Joe Blogs threw together. Okay, so let's talk about some of the these different scenarios. So let's talk about business-led self-service BI. So business-led self-service BI, where all the content's owned and managed by the creators, right? Subject matter experts. Responsibility is retained within the business unit. The strategy is described as bottom-up or decentralized, as we said. It's a good strategy for personal BI and small teams. One thing to note here is that business-led self-service BI is not the same as like shadow IT. Okay, so BI content's created and added, owned and managed by the business units. However, shadow IT kind of implies that they're going off and doing something that IT doesn't know about, right? Which does kind of happen in the Power BI world. Particularly, they might download Power BI desktop for free or whatever, and then they're just working away in the shadows, and they never really publish to the service. They just do it on desktop. There is that kind of concept of having a shadow IT. Business-led self-service BI needs to be intentional. It's not something that kind of grows out of nothing, right? So and happens and circumvents IT completely, because if you try and circumvent IT, you're just going to run into a world of hurt. So you need resources and support particularly from your center of excellence. So that's where your center of excellence people come in, right? So that's where you need IT involved to say, okay, we're going to allow people to do these things, and here is the sandbox in which they can play, and here is how we're going to set that up for them. But they kind of can do anything from within these kind of guide rails. And so this is how you really want to be careful about. You don't just turn Power BI on and say go for it, because you're going to end up with you just end up, particularly in a large organization. In a small one, you can get away with it for a while. So when is business-led sort of the bottom-up approach most suitable? When decentralized data management aligns with the organization's data culture. Yeah, so if you are going for a very decentralized management of your data, you're going full data democratization, everybody has access to everything and away you go, then obviously self-service BI is going to be great. Data exploration and freedom to innovate is high. So it's all about agile innovation. Let's do things quickly. Let's experiment. Let's try and fail fast. All of those types of things. If you're hearing that in your organization, then a bottom-up approach is probably going to be a good approach for that type of team, whether that's an innovation team or you're doing those kind of rapid iterations on projects. If you've got a business unit that wants to have a high level of control, they don't want a lot of involvement, and they're pretty sort of, they operate pretty independently, then obviously a business-led kind of solution is going to be pretty good there. And sometimes you find, business units have, even some IT skills and things like that. Just depends on the way your organization's kind of arranged. And you need the skilled people inside that business unit. So those people need to be capable of and committed to supporting solutions through their entire life cycle. I think there's this perception, particularly in with Power BI reporting, is that it's like a waterfall project, and you start and then you build the report and then you finish and then the report, and it works forever. But that's not, as we all know, anyone who's built any kind of Power BI knows that it's the wrong way to think about any kind of business intelligence solution. Business intelligence solutions aren't a project. They're a product, right? And so within your organization, you're building, if you think about it as a product development life cycle, and then the consistently maintaining that product over time, that's what it is. So you're going to have versions of that product. That product's going to be consistently require support for people. It's much better to think about your reporting artifacts as products than it is to think of them as projects. And if you need high flexibility to respond to sort of changing, you've got a very dynamic business. You know, you're changing all the time. If you're in a startup situation, for example, or you're in the middle of a big pivot, your business conditions change and you need to react quickly to then, if that outweighs the need for governance and oversight and all that kind of stuff, then you're potentially going to be better off going for a self-service solution. If you want to be successful with business-led self-service BI, which a lot of people do, obviously. Don't know what I've done there. Hang on. This is a really good one. Teach your creators to use the same techniques that IT or BI team would use. Yeah. So if you're using this concept of decoupling and using shared data sets, you know, you're publishing your data set up and then you're creating reports off the top of that data set, teach the people the self-service BI the same techniques. If you're getting more advanced and you're using like versioning control and data and data ops style techniques where you're doing maybe even automatic publishing or using pipelines, teach them how to do that. Teach them how to do it properly. Having fewer duplicated data sets, like those types of things are going to they're just good practice, and so it's going to reduce the risk of the people who are out there in self-service land creating stuff that becomes an overhead for IT later because that person leaves or whatever. The job of your centralized team then it becomes focused on mentoring, training, resources, and documentation. Yeah, and so you need to be able to provide all of those things so that self-service BI users can be successful. So focus on your mentoring, your training, and resources to ensure that that's good. We're going to cover mentoring and user enablement in one of the other sessions. It's just the better you do that, the more people are prepared, the better outcomes you'll have in terms of your self-service situations. Provide guidance on how to use things like endorsements so people can endorse data sets, and that was those data sets that we were looking at here. Provide guidance on how to use those. You know, when should it be promoted? When should it be certified? If you're doing this kind of business-led self-service stuff, that needs to be, you need to be using the full features of Power BI as well. And then there's things like goals, which is a whole other kettle of fish where you might have, you know, like KPIs or these actionable sort of goals that people are trying to do. Now, goals is now available on pro licenses. That's a whole area where you can start to put, okay, all your key actionable KPIs on the top. They kind of act like dashboards are kind of supposed to act, you know? And so you can have that click through data to show that. And I think, you know, investigate looking at goals to show high level KPI stuff, I think, and showing people how to do those goals properly. Given that that's still fairly new, but it's starting to become more and more relevant and powerful as time goes on. I've been tracking goals fairly closely. So you might reserve the use of certified for enterprise content, right? So that's one thing that you might need to think about is you've got promoted and then you've got certified. Well, certified might be only data sets that are created by your enterprise BI team, for example. And then you can potentially analyze your activity logs, right? To see how, so you've got, you know, your center of excellence or the people who are responsible for maintaining the system. They are going to proactively look for people who are using owners and people who are using the system. Yeah. And I know a few organizations that have done this and it's really great, right? So you're looking at your activity logs, you're looking at your usage reporting from your premium service, for example. And you're going, okay, here's my top 5 users. Reach out to those users, find what's working for the system, what's not working in the system, offer helpful information, that kind of stuff. So you really want to do that, especially if you can't find that they're doing something in a weird way. It's kind of not so good. Okay, so the second approach is our managed self-service BI approach. Kind of like I said, this is the aspirational kind of area for a lot of people. This is where you've got a blended approach. You've got data owned on one end by corporate and you've got, or by a centralized team. So it could be IT, it could be enterprise BI team, whatever. And then you've got the reports and the dashboards. Everybody, the content creation is the responsibility of the business. Yeah. So subject matter experts within the business. So your managed self-service BI is a good strategy for your team and departmental BI. Okay, so when is this suitable? It's going to be suitable, like we said, it sort of how it depends on when it aligns with your culture, right? So if centralized data management aligns with your organization's data culture, that means you want to own the data, but you don't necessarily care about what content gets created on top of that. Like I said, this is my favorite one because that's a pretty common scenario where you do want to have centralized ownership of the data at least. Organization has the BI, but you need the skills to be able to manage that data architecture, right? So if you don't have a centralized team that can manage your data architecture, then this is not necessarily going to be the best solution for you. And neither is corporate BI because you just don't have that, right? If you've got a lot of reuse scenarios, so data is reused by lots of different creators across different organizational boundaries, then this is going to be a suitable approach for you. So you've got this data reuse scenario happening. And then when you've got high demand and people can do it themselves quicker than IT can. I think this is one of the key reasons why people want to go down this route. Yeah, is that there's only so much capacity within your BI team or within your IT team. And that capacity is usually reserved for the stuff that's high priority. And, you know, Jerry in marketing doesn't necessarily always is not always high priority, but he wants stuff fast or whatever. And so if he's got the skills to do it, then let him do it. Let's, get people can create their own content faster than IT can do it. If you've got a scenario where there's lots of different people responsible for handling data prep, data modeling, and report creation, so it's not it's suitable in that scenario as well. Okay, guidelines for being successful with our self-service BI model. So the key thing here is separating our model development and our report development. So the piece being you create a master data set that is well formed. You create a really nice star schema data model. You publish that up to the service. Then your report development reports get connected to that data set, and then you create your reports on top of that. So you're separating the two disciplines. That way you can have centralized managed self-service because you've got one person managing the model and one person managing the report. You can use live connections. You can use that new query table, which we only discovered in the first week of this, where you can actually direct query a single table off a data set, which is awesome. But you're decoupling the data from the report. Use data flows. So data flows are going to be really useful in this kind of managed scenario because data flows mean that you can have someone in the centralized team build the Power Query, right? It could be a complex kind of Power Query scenario where you're merging a bunch of stuff. Maybe you need to write some complex SQL. You're doing some weird stuff in Power Query. It's not going to be easy for end users to replicate. Then you use a data flow, you publish that up to the cloud, and it's just a table for people to download then, and it can access it really easily, right? So data flows are fantastic for decoupling that kind of scenario for the Power Query, just the Power Query side. Commonly used data tables. So your customers, your products, your patient data table, whatever. You might just create a centralized data flow for that brings all of that stuff together. You get much better consistency. Everybody's using kind of the same tables to create their data models. That would be in a scenario where you've got your self-service users, they're actually doing modeling, and your centralized BI team are actually only responsible for sort of up to the point where they shape the data, and then the model side goes to the other side. Direct query. So we spoke a little bit about using direct query. So you can use direct query over the existing Power BI datasets or Azure Analysis Services as well, of course. Everything in Power BI is kind of Azure Analysis Services anyway. Using certified endorsement. So using the certified endorsement for datasets that are and data flows. So content creators can go, okay, this is the definition of the patient data. This is the certified one. I'm going to use this for my super special report. So you can create those kind of endorsement things. Again, consistent branding. So you want to ensure that branding, and so this is for when you're doing self-service. It's about creating branding guidelines and templates so that people can do this easily for themselves, and ensure that people know who produce the content and who to contact for help, because you've decentralized that now. There's no you can't just ring the BI team and get help with the report. They need to go to the person who created the report for help on that report. It takes the pressure off the BI team, and they like that. So you want to make sure that that's front and center of all of the reports. Who is the person responsible? And that's got to be built into the culture of your of your BI solution. Consider implementing separate workspaces. So when you're doing managed self-service BI, you're going to separate potentially your data sets and your reports, different workspaces. You can consume a report from a different data set and publish it to a different workspace. Yeah. So then you have these concept of centralized data set workspaces that are going to help you do that. It also helps with content management. You get better clarity around who's responsible. You can have workspace role assignments to restrict content access and ownership. That way report creators can only publish content to their reporting workspace and then only read from the special dataset workspace, right? So they only have control to do certain things to different areas. And then you can also take advantage of things like row level security so that people can only see the data that they have access to. So separate workspaces are going to help with that. And then your centralized team is potentially going to take advantage of using like the Power BI REST APIs to compile an inventory of artifacts, analyzing the ratio of data sets and having a look at. So this is all about kind of monitoring from the centralized team, right? You're going to have a look at which data reports are being used and then reused and that kind of stuff. And there's lots of really interesting stuff around that available, either as like Power BI reports and using the REST APIs to be able to monitor your tenant. So that's worth looking up. Check out all the REST API capability. Okay, Enterprise BI, the third and final one. So Enterprise BI is our centralized approach. Every IT own everything. It's not always IT, of course, but you've got a centralized team, and they're responsible, and they just do the lot. Okay, so when is this going to be most suitable? So it's suitable again when that makes sense for your organization's data culture, right? So centralizing content management, single teams alignment, it's probably got a lot to do with regulatory stuff. You're going to have an enterprise BI scenario. You need a lot of BI expertise to manage all of this stuff, though, and if you've got a lot of BI artifacts, they're going to be responsible for managing a lot of BI artifacts. And they're the centralized team, so everyone's going to go to them for help. And we have that issue where capacity can be a thing. It's particularly good where the content needs of consumers are well defined. So anyone that has spent any time building Power BI content will be able to tell you that if people are kind of a bit not sure about what they need and what they want and what they need to report on, you can go through a lot of iterations trying to get to that answer. Yeah, so when you build your Power BI report, you end up in this iteration cycle of building stuff and then rebuilding and then rebuilding and then rebuilding. And so, I mean, a lot of this work that we do when we're working with clients is around reducing the number of iterations we need to do. You want to get things as right as possible so that you don't have to do as many iterations, but that's difficult to do. It's really hard to get right. We're in iteration 403 of our development process, and we still have scenarios where we're having to go back and rework things because people don't know what they don't know. And so if the needs of those end user report consumers are not well defined, they can't give you like very rigid kind of here it is and here's all the business rules and here's what it's going to look like and all that kind of stuff. Then centralized BI is hard because you're just going to be constantly reworking your reports and you're going to be constantly in this sort of development cycle. So if it's fairly well defined, then you're in a good spot for centralized BI. Content ownership and direct access to data needs to be limited to only a small number of people for security usually reasons or governance reasons. So only your data sets are, you've got a lot of PII in there. Hospital's another great example of this kind of stuff where you've got a lot of sensitive data and you need, it needs to be limited in terms of who can access what. Then, those are going to be centralized scenarios, at least up to a point. So you need to take that data, maybe, de-identify it, so that it can be used in aggregate reporting, for example, before you can make it available for self-service. And yes, data is highly sensitive, just like we just said. So direct access is limited to a small number of people. Why? Because it's highly sensitive or subject to regulatory requirements. Okay, so how do we be successful when we're implementing our enterprise BI? implement rigorous process. so use certified endorsement. You pretty much have to use certified endorsements. You're going to have a strong quality control process around content that gets put into your environment, because you can't solve everybody's problem at once. You've only got so much capacity in your BI team, so you need to have a process for getting that in. And then the more efficient that process, you can start to look into things like data ops and other techniques for automating certain parts of the process. Use deployment pipelines, use certified endorsements. You're going to start at looking at these automation, and automated testing and that kind of stuff, so that you're going to define those processes, and you're going to have a really strong process around how things get deployed into your environment. The better your process is for how you implement that, then the more capacity your BI team is going to have to be able to put content out in a faster way, right? So that's going to become really, really crucial. And if you're at the Power BI Summit and there's a session on data ops, I would really recommend for anyone who's working in a large centralized BI team to look at that data ops session. He's got a GitHub where he's got an example of how to deploy a report automatically and automatically have it tested and feedback to you if there's any issues with the report as it's tested. It's really cool, and he uses a combination of Azure Data Ops and GitHub, and he uses DAX Studio to create automatic DAX testing. It's amazing. Include consistent branding on your enterprise BI reports. So obviously anything that's created by the enterprise team needs to have consistent branding, as we've already discussed. Who produced content, who to contact for help. So we know that from the previous ones. And then we spoke about having specific, if you've got specific report branding, this is an interesting one, be careful about saving a copy. Okay, so then you have to turn off. Basically, they're saying here is watch out for your personalization features in Power BI. So you need to have a look at your tenant settings, and you need to potentially turn off stuff that would allow people to download a copy and personalize it if it's got enterprise content, branded content on it. Yeah, so you might need to turn that off for certain reports. It's a good way to allow people to kind of create content on their own stuff and personalize it and make them feel like they have control. But if you're in this corporate enterprise BI situation, you might not want that, because that's going to potentially work against you. If you separate if you provide a template file, so they're suggesting here that if you provide a seamless way to deal with this for self-service authors who want to potentially create their own content rather than saving a copy, you turn that off in your tenant, and then you provide template files to your users. So they say this is the acute inpatient model or whatever, and you give them the template. It does the template, and then they can create their own content on that, but it doesn't contain all the branding that you have for your enterprise content. So think about that as a solution. Okay, how are we going? We're going okay. Okay, so sometimes you might find that you need to transfer ownership of your content from one team to another. So ownership transfer from a business unit, for example, to your centralized team. So your business unit has been building all of this content, and then they're like, oh, this is bigger than what we originally planned, or we now want to centralize because there's a new centralized IT thing. How do we go from the business unit to the centralized team? Okay, so this can happen when you've got a business-led solution is used by a lot of people. Whoops, that wasn't the right one. Sorry. So if your solution starts to get a lot of usage, you might find it's bigger than what the person who originally built it can handle. So they need to transfer it to the BI team or the IT team. So that's one reason it could, because they need more governance, or it's become the source of truth and this mission critical report, and this person can't really support it. These business-led solutions often happen, like where people create something clever or something really cool that everybody starts using, that can do that. The other thing that might happen is you might have a situation where the business unit can't support it because they lose the key person, or they don't have the budget to maintain that anymore. They need to take that resource off that. And so they don't have the capacity to manage that content anymore. And so that can be one of the reasons why that that ownership transfer needs to happen. Size or complexity of a solution might grow to a point where different architecture is needed. So this is where your report it works and it's great, but it gets slow over time, or because they're using, say, a data flow, and someone needs to push it back up into Azure. They need to push a whole complex sort of set of queries back up into your Azure SQL or into your data warehouse, because although it was great and did the job at the time, it's sort of grown unwieldy for someone to do that. So the size and complexity of your data has grown to a point. Or you've just done a proof of concept inside a business unit, and now you want to operationalize or productionize that, do that, right? So you need a procedure for identifying when a solution is a candidate for ownership transfer. So this is what you need. So this is something you need to think about if you're doing these sort of self-service scenarios, if you're having that kind of scenario. And this is important for you guys who are consultants as well, right? Because you're often the people who are there building stuff, and you're building these POCs and you're holding their hand and you're doing that kind of stuff. And then you need to transfer the ownership of that product. It's not a project. It doesn't end. It's a product that needs to be continuously maintained by your customer. Or you can try and lock them in with a support contract or whatever, like a lot of consulting companies go for that kind of stuff. But customers generally don't like that. They want to have that kind of ownership, unless they really are committed to saying, well, we just are going to outsource all of our BI, and that's more than fine, of course. But often, like consultants, we're often working hand in hand with some kind of BI team. And so we need a process for being able to transfer the ownership of what we built over. Think about help desk personnel. Yeah. So what happens when someone calls help? Because in large organizations, you can have help desk. The help doesn't even know about Power BI, and they need to know what are the things that they can triage and help with, and what are the things that need to be escalated to the developer or that kind of stuff. So patterns for self-service creators to build and grow a solution and hand off in certain circumstances is an indicator of a productive and healthy data culture. So if you've got this mature kind of way of handling this, then you're in a good place in terms of your data culture. A simple ownership transfer may be addressed during, say, your center of excellence sort of meetings. How do we do that? A complex transfer might need a little project, right? So you put a project together to say, okay, we're moving from one type to another. Think about the owner of the data sets, particularly if you're moving from one owner to another. And if there's any refactoring that might be that might need to happen in terms of rebuild, there's a lot of time associated with doing that, and it often happens in the back end, so it's not very visible to your end users and to your stakeholders and stuff. So they say, well, you just take this and you move it over there, take you a day, good luck. And they don't fully appreciate that even though you're going to end up with the same result, there could be a huge amount of refactor, particularly when you get that complexity issue where you're going from maybe you have a simple data set, that somebody's created, they've connected to 3 different source systems. Those source systems are direct connects, and it's really easy, and then they hit publish and go, and you're moving that to a situation where all that data has to come out, be put into a data lake. Then from the data lake, you've got a transformation piece that puts it up into a data warehouse. And then from the data warehouse, it comes out into a Power BI data set. Like if you're going from a casual kind of BI scenario to an enterprise BI scenario, and then you end up with exactly the same report, but this one supports 1 trillion rows and this one only supports up to 100 million. Like that is a huge amount of work potentially for people to do that ownership transfer. And so you need to have that awareness amongst the owners of the data sets and things like that, because otherwise they're just not going to give you funding. Sometimes it might happen where you transfer the other way, right? So you might transfer from centralized to decentralized. And that could be where your team with domain knowledge is better equipped to own and manage the content. So IT's overwhelmed, BI team's overwhelmed. This is a small project. It's fairly simple. There's a small product. This is fairly simple. There's and so you might want to do a hand back to the business in that scenario. Or the centralized team's creating a solution for the business unit that doesn't have the skills to necessarily create it from scratch, but they can kind of maintain it going forward, and they're kind of learning and extend the solution from there. So that's a common consulting scenario, right? Where you as a consultant are creating a solution for the business unit, but they're not going to be able to build it from scratch. They need to know too much, but they are kind of getting into Power BI and they can kind of maintain it from there. Don't forget to recognize and reward the original creator, it says here, particularly if the ownership transfers are a common occurrence. So give credit to the person who built it. You can put a little thing on the report, originally by Greg Nash. No, I don't know. Things to think about when you're doing your ownership, when you're doing your content ownership and management. Having a deep understanding of your content ownership is really important. Yeah. So ensure you deeply understand how content ownership and management is happening. So these are often, processes that get overlooked when it comes to Power BI. And it's like, it's not a one size fit all approach. It's not going to fit uniformly across the organization. So you need to look at the different ways that people are owning content, how they're managing their workspaces and that kind of stuff. What works well, determine what is currently working well and what isn't working well. So, that was a horrible paste. Hang on. So what's the different balance between those different ownership strategies? Some things are going to be better off being self-service. Some things are going to be better off being centralized. Have those discussions in your organization. So think about those things. If your current Enterprise BI team has challenges relating to scheduling and priorities, do an assessment to determine if you can get away with a managed self-service BI strategy. Is it really what they say? Because that's a really effective way to take the pressure off your Enterprise BI team. Yeah, and that's where you just like Enterprise BI teams are the busiest people in IT. They just never ending work because there's a never ending number of questions people can ask about the business, and so they're always gonna be really busy. So it's going to be a common scenario. Clarifying your terms, so clarifying your roles, particularly around ownership, data stewardship, and subject matter experts. Yeah, so who owns data, who looks after data from a quality and data entry kind of point of view, and then who knows what the data means. So those things are going to be ensure they get documented and have a backup person so that there's when someone's on holiday they can make decisions, that kind of stuff. People who are content owners and things like that, bring them into your community of practice. Ensure they come to your lunch and learn sessions that you'll be running all by yourself in your organization at some point. Or, bring them along to this kind of stuff. I'm more than happy to host, extra people to talk about, different content ownership. But I mean, the difference is, you're going to be able to talk with them in your community of practice about your specific scenarios. So that's always going to be a key thing. Determine how you use the contacts feature in Power BI. So communicate with content creators how it should be used. So the contacts feature is like your contacts on your data sets. See if we can bring up an example. I don't have much time, so if I can't find it straight away, then we'll just have to. So they're really talking about here in your data sets who these contacts are, and then you have like support contacts inside your apps and stuff as well. So when you create a new app, not get app. Can I just quickly create a new app? Do I have a DIAD here? This will do. Update app. So you have contact information down here, right? Show the app publisher. You can have different individuals or groups added as email addresses as the content owner of that app. So there's all these content ownership bits and pieces inside Power BI that you can take advantage of, and people can see who the content owner is for different reports, different data sets, different apps, all that kind of stuff. If you have ownership transfers and they're happening regularly, create a process. Yeah, so you need a rigid process for how content ownership works. So you need to know how to transfer it from one to the other or back again. And then think about how you use external tools for advanced authoring. Yeah, so Centralized BI, or if you've got a BI team, they're potentially going to be the ones who are going to now have access to all the cool stuff. DAX Studios of the world, Tabular Editor, other tools that are going to allow people to do advanced authoring. Things like calculation groups is a great example of where you've got, an external tool. You need to kind of do that. It's an advanced sort of area, or maybe you're doing partitioning. Inside your Power BI data sets that needs advanced. That's an advanced capability, and you need an advanced person to do that. So think about how that's going to work for your different areas. All right, we're down to our maturity level. So how do you know where you're at right now? And then we'll be done. I'm just going to paste the whole table. Sorry about all the text, but we'll just highlight bits and pieces, and then we'll go from there. So if you're at a low level of content ownership, then basically content's owned and managed by self-service creators. It's uncontrolled. There's no specific strategy. You've got a high ratio of data set to report. So that means there's a one-to-one ratio between every data set has a report. So you're not potentially using shared data sets, and so you're potentially duplicating data all over the place. There's lots of discrepancies between different reports that might be show the same thing. So this says we've got 300 patients in today, and this says we've got 279 patients in today. Why are those two things different? Someone's using a slightly different technique or definition of patient, that kind of thing. Level 200, you've got a plan in place for content ownership. So that's kind of the first place to start. Look at who owns content, who are those stewards, owners, and subject matter experts. Your initial steps have been taken to improve the consistency and trustworthiness for self-service. So you're starting to create data sets that people can trust for self-service, and you're starting to put guidance together for the community that includes how things need to be built inside your organization. You get to level 300, you're now looking at your managed self-service BI as a priority. It's an area of investment. You've got a lot of backing from your executive sponsorship. You've got projects around it. You're doing things now. You've got consistent report branding. You've got a mentoring program so self-service people can create best practices, make good decisions, that kind of stuff. As you get into high capability, you're going to have governance requirements for different content is going to be created. You've got a plan in place for how to handle ownership transfers. So you can request an ownership transfer, you can handle it. There's a process in place for that. Managed self-service BI techniques and reuse of data are common and well understood. And so you're in a really good place there. And then in the efficient phase, you've got all the stuff in place. And now you're looking at, proactively you're monitoring the activity logs, and you're looking for efficiencies, and you're actually, creating, you've got that really high level kind of usage happening, and you've got the external use by your external tools like your tabular editors and stuff used by highly proficient content creators that are doing all sorts of cool things around that. You're putting in DevOps or data ops. You're doing that stuff there. And so that's it. That's content ownership in a nutshell for Power BI. And that's pretty good time. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Next week, we're going to talk about content delivery. We might talk a little bit about governance, depending on how much content there is there. I knew this was a long one, so I wasn't going to do two. So we'll talk about content delivery scope and governance. And yeah, that will be about it. Could you please post the link for that? Which was that, Catalina? Just I might have been in the middle of talking. I didn't see that come through. Or have we lost her? Maybe. She's not still online. Oh well, I missed the link. Oh well, hopefully she gets the link from somewhere. Anyway, that's Lunch and Learn for another week. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to hang around for a little while. If you want to stick around and have a chat, I am going to stop the recording and we'll go from there. But yeah, we'll see you next week.